I have been an analyst for the Keth Directorate Strategic Assessment Division for 31 years, and I have never before requested that a record be sealed. I am requesting it now, not because the record is shameful, not because it exposes a failure in Keth doctrine that our senior commanders would prefer to bury. Both of those things are true, but they are not the reason. The reason is simpler and, I think, harder to explain to anyone who has not spent the last 4 weeks doing what I have done. Sitting in this archive chamber with the raw data from the Oreth Corridor campaign spread across 7 display panels, running and rerunning the behavioral models, and arriving, each time, at the same conclusion. The models are not broken. The humans were simply not in them. What follows is my formal assessment of the Oreth Corridor engagement, specifically of the 43rd Consolidated Human Defense Force's performance during the 41 days between the encirclement at Heron's Reach and the eventual Keth withdrawal. I am filing this as an internal record rather than a command-level summary, because I believe a command-level summary would be edited until it said something other than what I am about to say. And what I am about to say is, in my professional judgment, the most important thing the Keth Directorate has learned about human military behavior in the 18 years since first contact. I will try to be precise. The encirclement at Heron's Reach was textbook. I want that noted at the outset, not to defend the operation's outcome, but because the outcome cannot be properly understood without understanding how well the operation was executed up to the point of encirclement. The 4th Sweep Wing closed the corridor mouth in 8 standard hours, which was 6 hours ahead of projection. The Oreth transit lanes were cut within the first day, which denied the 43rd any resupply from the outer settlements. The orbital suppression grid came up fully functional at day 3, which grounded their air assets. By the end of the first week, according to every metric the Directorate uses to assess the viability of a surrounded force, the 43rd Human Defense Force was finished. I am going to explain what finished means in doctrine terms, because I want the comparison to be clear. A force is considered strategically non-viable when it has passed what our planners call the cascade threshold, the point at which 3 or more primary sustainment categories have been reduced below operational minimums simultaneously. The thinking is straightforward. A force can sustain combat effectiveness through shortfalls in 1 or even 2 categories if its command structure and morale remain intact. But when ammunition, medical capacity, and nutrition fall simultaneously below the operational floor, the cognitive and physical load on individual combatants exceeds the thresholds that any species biology can sustain for longer than a few days. After that, a force does not fight. It exists, and existence under encirclement pressure becomes untenable quickly. By the end of week 1, the 43rd had passed the cascade threshold in 5 of the 8 sustainment categories we track. I reviewed the drone surveillance records from that period last month and cross-referenced them against the supply manifests we captured when the 43rd's forward logistics depot fell on day 6. At the point of encirclement, they had approximately 9 days of full ammunition at their then-current expenditure rate, which itself was already running at roughly 60% of standard combat tempo because they had begun rationing 3 days before the corridor closed. They had medical supplies sufficient for standard triage operations for perhaps 11 days, but not surgical capacity. Their surgical unit had been destroyed in the Day 2 bombardment. They had nutrition for somewhere between 14 and 18 days at reduced ration levels, depending on which of their storage caches our mapping had missed. They had no fuel for their mechanized assets after Day 8, when their last reserve depot burned. Command structure was intact. I should note that. Their senior officer, a colonel whose name appears throughout the captured records as Sarai Voss, was alive, functional, and actively directing operations from a hardened position in the Heron substrata. This is relevant. I will return to it. The point is, on day 9 of the encirclement, when I would have expected any rational force, Any force whose biology, psychology, and training operated according to the parameters our models use. To begin the process of negotiated withdrawal or surrender, the 43rd did neither. They attacked. I need to be careful here about what I mean by attacked, because that word, in the context of what the 43rd was at that point, requires some definition. They did not have armor. They did not have close air support. They had perhaps 40% of their pre-encirclement ammunition, and they had been operating on half rations for 72 hours. Their medical capacity was improvised, field dressings, antibiotics stretched thin, surgical procedures being performed by medics rather than surgeons because the surgeons were dead. Their mechanized vehicles were being pushed by hand in some cases, towed by others, because they had no fuel. Their communications equipment was operating on battery backup and salvaged power cells. In this condition, this is not an exaggeration. I have the drone footage. They attacked a fortified Keth forward position on the eastern edge of the Harran substrata, held by the 7th Consolidated Strike Battalion, which was at full strength, fully supplied, and expecting nothing more urgent than a siege they expected to win by attrition within another 2 weeks. The 43rd took the position. It took them 16 hours and they lost 31 soldiers doing it, which I note only because our models, when I ran them retroactively with the actual force compositions and supply states, projected a successful assault would require a force approximately 3 times larger with double the 43rd's remaining ammunition. The models were wrong by a factor of roughly 6 in terms of force efficiency. I have checked the input parameters 4 times. The data is clean. I will try to explain as precisely as I can what I think accounted for the discrepancy. And I want to say at the outset that I am not a combat officer. I am a logistics analyst. What I understand about warfare I understand through data, through supply curves and casualty projections and sustainment models, and the behavioral coefficients that our planning doctrine uses to estimate how a rational force under given stresses will perform. I'm not equipped to give you a tactical assessment of what happened at Harran's Reach. What I'm equipped to give you is an assessment of the gap between what every model I have said should have happened and what actually happened. The gap is the story. On day 9, when the 43rd attacked the 7th Strike Battalion's position, our surveillance assets were focused primarily on the likely surrender routes, the transit corridors through which a rational command would withdraw its surviving elements under negotiated terms. This is protocol. When an encirclement has succeeded, and the surrounded force has passed the cascade threshold, you prepare for the endgame, not for an offensive operation from the encircled force. We had 2 drones maintaining passive surveillance of the Harran substrata approaches, but they were positioned to detect outbound movement, not inbound assault formation. The first indication I have in the record that the 43rd was doing something unexpected is a terse communication from the 7th Strike Battalion commander to his sector command at hour 11 of what I had been tracking as day 9 of siege stabilization. The communication reads in translation: Contact, eastern approach, force strength unclear. They are not coming to talk. There is, after that, a gap of approximately 40 minutes in the communications record. I have reviewed this gap in some detail because it bothered me. 40 minutes is a long time. I eventually concluded, based on the fragmentary drone footage and the after-action reports filed by 7th Battalion survivors, that the gap represents the period during which the 7th's command element was too occupied with the actual mechanics of being assaulted to file situation reports. What emerged on the other side of that gap was not what I would have predicted. The 43rd had gone through the 7th's forward perimeter. I want to be clear about what that means. The 7th Strike Battalion's forward perimeter was a hardened emplacement, reinforced field positions, overlapping fields of fire, pre-registered suppression corridors. It was designed to blunt exactly the kind of frontal assault that a force in the 43rd's condition, low ammunition, no armor, no air support would be expected to mount. The design assumption behind the perimeter was that any rational attacker would have to expend more than they could afford to breach it, and that they would therefore either not attempt it or would abandon the attempt when the cost became prohibitive. The 43rd did not stop when the cost became prohibitive. I have the thermal imaging from the drone that was repositioned during the assault. I have reviewed it a significant number of times. What it shows is human soldiers moving through suppressed positions, positions where Keth suppressive fire should have pinned any conventional force by the simple mechanism of not stopping. They were not impervious to the fire. The casualty record is clear on that point. They were being hit. Some of them were hit multiple times. They kept moving. The model coefficient I use for human combat persistence under fire is 0.71, meaning that for every 10 human combatants who come under direct fire, my models expect approximately 7 to maintain forward movement, with the other 3 going to ground, seeking cover, or becoming casualties. That coefficient is derived from 63 prior engagements with human forces across 14 theaters. It is, by any standard, a well-supported figure. On that day, against the 7th Strike Battalion's perimeter, the effective persistence coefficient for the 43rd was somewhere above 0.9. I have run the retrospective models with different input values to try to find a set of assumptions that would produce the observed outcome. I have tried adjusting the ammunition expenditure curves. I have tried adjusting the casualty thresholds. I have tried varying the command coherence parameters. None of it brings the models into alignment with what actually happened, until I raise the persistence coefficient to somewhere between 0.88 and 0.94. What I cannot tell you is why. What I can tell you is that my best current hypothesis, based on everything I have reviewed over the past 4 weeks, is that the 43rd's persistence coefficient under those conditions, those specific conditions, a force that had passed the cascade threshold, that had no reasonable prospect of relief, that was fighting without armor and without fuel and without full ammunition, was higher than our model predicted for forces operating under significantly better conditions. And that does not make sense to me, not in terms of any mechanism I understand. It is the first anomaly. It will not be the last. Before I move to day 12, I want to spend some time with the 5 days preceding the attack, because I think those 5 days are, in some ways, more revealing than the attack itself. The days between the completion of the encirclement and the 43rd's first offensive action have, up to this point, received relatively little attention in the formal record. From the Keth Sector Command's perspective, those days were uninteresting. A period of siege stabilization during which the surrounded force was expected to be going through the predictable stages of a force that has accepted its situation. Initial frantic communication, attempts seeking relief that would not come, followed by consolidation of remaining assets, followed by the gradual behavioral indicators our models associate with a force that is calculating its surrender terms. The communications intercepts from those days tell a different story. I want to describe what I found in them, because I think it contradicts something important. I expected to find evidence of desperation, not panic. The 43rd's command element was professional enough that panic would have been managed, if not entirely suppressed. But desperation in the more clinical sense, the narrowing of focus that our models associate with forces in extreme sustainment stress, where medium-term planning gives way to day-by-day survival calculations, and where the behavioral register of communications shifts from operational to something more personal, more retrospective, more concerned with the finite. The 43rd's communications in days 5 through 8 did not look like that. They were loud. They were argumentative. They were, in a way that I found genuinely unexpected when I first encountered it in the raw intercepts, functional. Company commanders were filing detailed logistics requests not for the next 24 hours, but for the next 3 weeks, with contingency planning for scenarios that presupposed continued operations. The intelligence section was producing updated assessments of Keth force dispositions. The medical staff was writing formal requests for expanded pharmaceutical protocols, requests addressed to a logistics infrastructure that had ceased to exist, filed with the evident expectation that the filing would eventually matter. One exchange in particular has stayed with me. It is between the 43rd's chief logistics officer, a captain named Daryl Hone, and Colonel Voss on the morning of Day 7. Hone's assessment of the supply situation is bleak. He presents it in terms that are precise and unflinching, and the picture he draws is not compatible with sustained operations beyond 2 to 3 weeks. Voss's response, which I have read several times, is brief. Noted. What do we need to change that timeline? And then, after Hone provides the answer, resupply, or a captured enemy position with adequate stores, the conversation shifts immediately into an operational planning discussion about which Keth positions in the substrata vicinity hold the most valuable stores and how they might be reached. That is Day 7. They have been encircled for a week. They are on half rations and their medical capacity is improvised, and their mechanized assets are being managed for range against a fuel reserve that will run out in one more day. And the conversation is not, how do we negotiate terms, or how much longer can we hold? The conversation is, what do we need to change the timeline, and how do we get it? I am a logistics analyst. I have spent 31 years building and validating models of how forces in resource extremity behave. When I encountered that exchange, my first reaction was professional. I noted it as an anomaly and moved on to the next intercept. My second reaction, which came later, at approximately the midpoint of the 4 weeks I have spent on this review, was something else, not quite alarm, but something in that register. The recognition that the anomaly was not isolated, that the exchange between Voss and Hone on Day 7 was not an outlier in the data. It was the data. The 5 days before the attack were 5 days of planning. Not contingency planning in the sense of preparing for orderly retreat, not end-state planning in the sense of negotiating favorable surrender terms, operational planning. The 43rd, in the 5 days between the completion of the encirclement and their first offensive action, spent their time building an assault plan with the apparent expectation that the plan would be executed, and that execution would produce a useful result. I have tried to model the cognitive state required to produce that behavior in those conditions. I keep arriving at the same place. The 43rd was operating as though the problem were not yet solved, rather than as though the problem were beyond solving. And the difference between those two orientations, in terms of the behavioral outputs they produce, is significant enough that our models treat them as categorically distinct states. The models did not predict that the 43rd would be in the first state at Day 7 of the encirclement. They were. Day 12. By Day 12 of the encirclement, the 43rd had taken the 7th Strike Battalion's position and consolidated its supplies. I will not repeat the description of the assault. I have already covered it in some detail. What I want to focus on here is what happened in the 48 hours after the position fell. By any standard I would apply to a force that had just conducted a major offensive action under extreme sustainment stress, the 43rd should have needed a significant period to stabilize. Not rest, exactly. I would not use that word for a force that is still under encirclement, but a period of reduced operational tempo during which casualties were addressed, command structures were reconsolidated, and the captured supplies were integrated into the force's logistics chain. The 43rd did all of those things in approximately 11 hours. By the morning of Day 13, they were operationally reorganized. Their medical element was treating wounded using the 7th's captured equipment, and their logistics officers had completed a full inventory of captured stores and had produced an updated operational sustainability assessment. The assessment, which I recovered from the captured records, is worth noting. Captain Hohn's revised estimate, produced on day 13 with the benefit of the captured stores, was that the 43rd could sustain operations for an additional 3 to 4 weeks at current tempo, or approximately 6 weeks at reduced tempo. This was the third supply assessment he had produced since the encirclement began. The first had been filed before the encirclement was complete, as a standard pre-operation document. The second had been filed on day 7, in the context of the planning conversation with Colonel Voss that I described earlier. The third was filed on day 13, incorporating the captured stores. All three documents are written in the same register: professional, precise, analytical. Hohn does not, in any of the three, write as a man who believes he is preparing a document that will not matter. I notice this because I have reviewed a significant number of logistics documents produced by forces in extremity over the course of my career, and there is a recognizable shift in their register as the force's situation degrades beyond a certain point. The documents become shorter. They become more immediate in their time horizon. The contingency planning drops out, because contingency planning requires the assumption that there will be contingencies, that the force will persist long enough for multiple possible futures to matter. When a force has accepted, at the organizational level, that its situation is terminal, its logistics documents tell you so even when the words themselves are neutral. Hohn's documents do not tell me that. None of them. Not even the Day 7 assessment, which was produced at a point when, by any metric I use, the situation should have already been beyond the organizational acceptance threshold. I note this as a data point. I am not sure, even now, exactly what it tells me. What I am sure of is that it is consistent with everything else in the record. Day 19. After the capture of the 7th position, the Keth Sector Command concluded that the 43rd's action represented an anomaly. A desperate gamble that had, through a combination of tactical factors, and what the sector commander described in his report as regrettable overconfidence in our perimeter integrity, succeeded. The standard response to such a situation, once the anomaly has been identified, is to tighten the encirclement and wait. The resupply the 43rd had obtained would extend their viability, but not indefinitely. They were still encircled. The orbital suppression grid was still operational. Their air assets were still grounded. Time still favored the Keth. The sector commander's assessment on day 12, as filed, was that the 43rd would be in a position to negotiate withdrawal terms within another 20 to 25 days. On day 19, the 43rd attacked again. This time they hit the Keth logistics node at the northern edge of the substrata, a target that, again, when I run the models with the 43rd's known force composition and supply state at day 19, should have been beyond their effective reach. The logistics node was not a forward combat position. It was a supply and coordination hub, more heavily fortified than a standard field position, and positioned well behind the forward Keth line. To reach it, the 43rd would have had to move a significant element of their force through terrain that was under continuous drone surveillance, past 2 intermediate Keth positions, without being detected early enough for those positions to react effectively. They moved at night. They moved slowly. They used the substrata's natural geography, the deep rock channels and the irregular terrain features of the Harran Basin, to mask their thermal signatures. Some of them, the records suggest, spent upward of 12 hours in the channel approaches before the assault, lying still in cold rock, waiting for the surveillance window. 12 hours in the cold, on reduced rations, wounded some of them, waiting. I have thought about this specific element of the operation more than perhaps any other single thing in the 41-day record. 12 hours of cold silence, in preparation for an assault that, by any rational accounting of probability, should not have succeeded. The 43rd's personnel were not, at this point, in optimal physical condition. They had been under encirclement for 19 days. They had fought one major action and absorbed its casualties. They had been operating on variable ration levels and under sustained stress. The medical records I recovered from the captured 7th position records the 43rd's medical staff had begun keeping using the 7th's equipment, indicate that at day 19, approximately a third of the 43rd's surviving combatants were carrying unresolved injuries, fractures, lacerations, burns, internal damage from blast overpressure. Carrying those injuries, lying in a cold rock channel for 12 hours, waiting to attack. I have a coefficient for pain tolerance. For most species, severe pain above a threshold value produces behavioral diversion. The organism's focus shifts from the external objective to the internal sensation, and performance degrades accordingly. The coefficient I use for humans under pain stress is 0.76, meaning that a human combatant with a significant unresolved injury is expected to perform at 76% of their uninjured baseline. I have tried to make the logistics node assault make sense with that coefficient. I have tried it with 0.76. I have tried it with 0.82. I have tried it with 0.9. The attack as executed, the discipline of the approach, the silence of the 12-hour wait, the coordination of the assault itself, does not become explicable at any coefficient below roughly 0.94. I am not saying that injured humans feel no pain. The medical records from the 43rd are explicit on that point. There are logged complaints, requests for additional analgesics, descriptions of pain that are, reading them now, remarkable in their frankness. These were not soldiers who were unaware of or indifferent to their injuries. They were soldiers who were in significant pain and who did what they had come to do anyway. I think that is the distinction I am struggling to encode. The difference is not between pain and no pain. The difference is between pain as a limit and pain as a condition. In most of the species our behavioral models are built on, significant pain functions as a limit, a threshold above which performance and decision-making degrade sharply, because the organism's resources are being consumed by the pain signal itself. In the humans of the 43rd, over those 41 days, pain appeared to function as a condition, a persistent feature of their environment that they registered, documented with notable honesty, and continued operating through. I do not know how to model that. I am not sure the distinction I am drawing is scientifically precise. But I have reviewed the data 4 times, and I cannot find a better description of what I am observing. The logistics node fell on day 19. The Keth forces at the node were not at fault. They were not unprepared. They had adequate strength and their perimeter was sound. The 43rd simply moved through it in the dark, and then, when the movement was detected and the alarm was raised, closed the distance at a rate that the defending forces' response protocols were not designed to handle. The sector commander's revised assessment, filed on day 20. The 43rd continues to operate outside expected behavioral parameters. Recommend tightening the encirclement cordon and reducing the intervals between surveillance passes. The possibility that this force will attempt a corridor breakthrough cannot be discounted. The recommendation was approved. The cordon was tightened. Days 21 through 27. Between the second major action and the corridor breakthrough, there is a period of 6 days that the formal record treats as relatively quiet. A consolidation interval during which the Keth tightened their cordon and the 43rd, in the sector command's assessment, were recovering from the logistics node assault and preparing for the inevitable. The sector command's assessment was not entirely wrong. The 43rd was recovering. What it missed was that recovery, for the 43rd, was not a passive state. I have more communications data from this period than from any other in the 41 days, partly because the 43rd's communications operators had by this point adapted to the Keth surveillance frequencies and developed protocols for transmitting on intervals that reduced our intercept success rate. The data I have is therefore a partial picture. but it is a coherent one. What I observe in days 21 through 27 is a force conducting something that, when I first encountered it in the raw intercept data, I categorized as training. I have since revised that categorization. What the 43rd was doing in that period is more accurately described as systematic preparation, but preparation calibrated not for any single operation or any specific objective. They were preparing, as best I can reconstruct it from the intercepts, for whatever came next, understood broadly and without a specific plan yet attached. This is unusual. A force under encirclement, with limited resources and an active enemy cordon, does not typically invest significant effort in preparation that is not tied to a defined operational objective. The return on that investment is uncertain, and the cost, in energy and time, in the cognitive load placed on personnel who are already under sustained stress, is real. Our models treat this kind of diffuse preparatory activity as a behavioral indicator of a force that has access to planning horizons beyond the immediate, which is itself an indicator of a force that has not accepted that its immediate situation is terminal. The 43rd invested heavily in diffuse preparatory activity in days 21 through 27. Scout teams were ranging to the outer edges of what the Keth had calculated as the 43rd's operational radius, returning with detailed terrain surveys of areas that were not, at that point, part of any plan. Engineering personnel were conducting assessments of the substrata's structural features, its rock channels, its elevation changes, its natural concealment, that went well beyond what would be needed for their current defensive position. The medical staff was running what I can only describe as training exercises using the 7th's captured equipment, rotating personnel through procedures they had not previously been qualified to perform independently. There is one intercept from day 24 that I want to record here because it has stayed with me throughout the weeks of this review, in a way that data points rarely do. It is a brief exchange between Colonel Voss and one of her company commanders, a captain whose name appears in the records as Turl Marin. Marin is asking, with evident frustration, what the point is of the terrain surveys the scouts have been conducting in the northwestern approaches. The same approaches that would, 4 days later, become the breakthrough corridor. He describes the terrain as impassable, using language that, in translation, is blunt. There is no way through there, he says, and the surveys are consuming resources they cannot spare. Voss's response, as I have it from the intercept, is, "There's no way through there that we've found yet. That's different." I have read that line many times. I read it first when I was approximately 2 weeks into this review, and my initial response was to note it as an indicator of command psychology, evidence that Voss had not yet reached the acceptance threshold, consistent with what the rest of the data suggested. A professional observation, cleanly categorized. My later readings have been less clean. I think what bothers me about the line is the precision of the distinction it draws. Not "there is a way through." Voss does not assert that. Not "we will find a way through." She does not promise it. She says there is no way we've found yet, which is a statement about the current state of the search rather than a claim about the terrain. It is a logician's answer to a soldier's frustration. It treats the absence of a solution as a condition of the search rather than as a property of the problem. It is, I think, the clearest window into Colonel Voss's operational orientation that I have in the entire 41-day record. She was not running on hope. She was running on a refusal to close the inquiry before the inquiry was complete. 4 days later, her scouts found the northwestern corridor. The discovery of the corridor was not luck, although the Keth Sector Command's post-action assessment characterized it as such. The corridor existed because of a specific combination of terrain features that made continuous surveillance coverage technically difficult. An irregular rock formation that partially occluded the drone sensors, combined with an elevation change that created a brief detection shadow at certain approach angles. Identifying that shadow required knowing, with considerable precision, where the drones were, what their sensor profiles looked like, and exactly what geometry of approach would exploit the gap. The 43rd Scouts had been building that picture for 6 days. I want to be clear about what that means in practical terms. The Scouts were operating in the outer ranges of the 43rd's operational radius, which put them in proximity to the Keth cordon, which made their movements dangerous. They were conducting those movements under the same conditions the rest of the 43rd was operating under: limited supplies, unresolved injuries, sustained stress over 3 weeks of encirclement. They were doing it without any guarantee that what they were looking for existed. The terrain surveys were an investment with uncertain return, undertaken because a commander had told a frustrated captain that the difference between "no way through" and "no way we found yet" was a distinction worth acting on. The return came on day 27, when a scout team returned with a survey of the northwestern approaches that showed, for the first time, the detection shadow. The planning session that followed lasted 14 hours. I want to pause here and say something that may seem peripheral, but which I believe is essential to understanding the full picture. In the 4 weeks I have spent reviewing this record, I have read every piece of communications intercept from the 43rd's internal channels that we were able to recover. This includes operational orders, medical logs, logistics requests, command-level discussions, and because the 43rd's communication protocols were less rigidly compartmentalized than Keth standards, a significant amount of informal communication between individual soldiers. I want to describe what I found in that informal communication, because it contradicts something I expected to find. I expected to find evidence of desperation, of bargaining, of the cognitive and emotional markers our behavioral science division has identified as characteristic of forces that have passed the cascade threshold and accepted, at some level, even if not formally, that they are not going to survive. There is a documented behavioral profile for this condition. It is not unique to any single species. It appears with remarkable consistency across the data we have collected. The communications shift. They become shorter. They become focused on immediate concerns, the next meal, the next rotation, the next day, rather than medium-term objectives. Retrospective communication increases. Soldiers talk about things they did before the war, places they have been, people they miss. Planning vocabulary decreases. A surrounded force that has accepted its situation does not sound like a force that believes it has a future to plan for, because it does not. The 43rd's informal communications did not sound like that. They were loud by the standards of forces in their situation. They were argumentative. There are records of genuine, substantive disagreements between officers about tactical choices, about resource allocation, about which objectives to prioritize. Argumentation, in the behavioral literature, is associated with forces that still believe their choices matter. You do not argue about which road to take if you have accepted that you are not going anywhere. They were also, and this is the part I find most difficult to articulate precisely, funny. I do not mean that as a soft observation. I mean it as a behavioral data point. The informal communications from the 43rd throughout the 41 days contain a consistent thread of what I can only describe as deliberate, crafted humor, not the nervous, reflexive kind our models associate with acute stress, but the slower, considered kind that requires some cognitive distance from one's immediate situation. Jokes about the food, jokes about the enemy. Jokes, notably, about their own situation, about the absurdity of their position, about the gap between what their situation objectively was and how they were choosing to respond to it. One exchange I pulled from the intercepts, on approximately day 22, between two soldiers I cannot fully identify from the record. One asks the other how many more of these operations they think the colonel has planned. The other's answer, after a pause that the timestamp makes visible, is probably as many as it takes. And then, after another pause, which is unlucky for someone. Neither of them specifies who the unlucky party is. Neither of them sounds afraid. I do not have a behavioral coefficient for this. I'm not sure what it means in terms of the formal models I use. What I can say is that in 41 days of communications from a force that every model I have said should have been in behavioral and cognitive decline, I did not find the communications profile of a force in decline. I found the communications profile of a force that was angry and tired and hungry and in pain, and that had not yet finished deciding what it was going to do about it. That distinction between the profile of decline and the profile of a force that has not finished deciding is not one my models currently capture. I am noting it here because I believe it should be captured, and because the Orath corridor engagement is the clearest evidence I have encountered in 31 years that the distinction is operationally significant. Day 28. By this point, the Keth cordon had been tightened twice, and the surveillance interval had been reduced to a continuous pass rather than a scheduled one. The sector commander had also, following the logistics node assault, requested and received 2 additional strike battalions, bringing the total Keth force encircling the 43rd to something over 3 times the human force's estimated remaining strength. The 43rd's estimated remaining strength at day 28 was approximately 62% of their day 1 encirclement figure. They had taken casualties in both major actions, and they had also lost personnel to wounds, illness, and 2 smaller skirmishes in the intervening days that did not rise to the level of major engagements, but that produced casualties nonetheless. They were smaller, they were more degraded, they had been under encirclement for 4 weeks. On day 28, Colonel Voss made a decision that I have spent more time analyzing than any other single decision in the 41-day record. She split her force. Specifically, she divided the 43rd into 3 independent operational elements, each with its own command structure, its own supply allocation, and its own assigned objective. 2 of the elements were assigned diversionary objectives, positions in different parts of the cordon that they would probe and attack, drawing Keth attention and response assets. The 3rd element, the largest, though not by a large margin, was assigned the actual operational objective, which was a gap in the northwestern edge of the cordon that Voss's scouts had identified as the point of lowest coverage. The plan required precise timing. The 2 diversionary elements had to engage simultaneously, at a time calculated to draw the maximum Keth response before the 3rd element attempted the gap. The timing window for the gap attempt was narrow. The gap existed in part because of terrain features that made continuous coverage difficult, and exploiting it required moving during a specific interval in the surveillance rotation. The surveillance rotation had been reduced to a continuous pass. There was no interval. And yet the 3rd element found one. I have reviewed the drone footage from the northwestern cordon at the relevant time. What I can reconstruct is this. The 2 diversionary attacks began at the scheduled time, and the Keth response, which was rapid and substantial, because the sector command was by this point treating any 43rd action as a priority event, drew 3 of the 5 response elements that were available. The remaining 2 response elements were positioned to cover the logical breakthrough routes, none of which included the northwestern approach because the terrain there made a vehicle movement effectively impossible. The 43rd's 3rd element did not move vehicles, they went on foot, through terrain that Keth planning had classified as impassable for combat operations, because Keth planning had assessed it using standard movement trait coefficients for a force that would need to maintain formation integrity, protect its wounded, and move at a pace consistent with combat effectiveness at the far end. The 43rd moved faster than the terrain was supposed to allow. I have the timeline. The gap they found not in the surveillance rotation, which was genuinely continuous, but in the response time between detection and interception was approximately 11 minutes. To exploit an 11-minute gap, moving through terrain classified as impassable, with wounded personnel, in the dark, they covered a distance that my movement models, using the best coefficients I have for human forces under sustained stress, predict should have taken between 22 and 27 minutes. They did it in 9. I have checked this figure. I have checked the timeline against 3 separate data sources. The figure is consistent across all 3. They covered that distance through that terrain in 9 minutes. I have a hypothesis about why. It is not comfortable to articulate, because it implies something about the relationship between resource deprivation and human performance that runs counter to nearly everything in our current models. Our models treat resource deprivation as uniformly degrading, more stress, less capacity, reduced performance across all measured dimensions. This is, for virtually every species we have modeled, accurate. Starvation impairs cognition. Sleep deprivation impairs judgment. Pain degrades focus and coordination. These are not controversial findings. They are foundational to the behavioral science that underlies Keth's strategic planning. The 43rd had been under resource deprivation for 28 days. They were, by our models, substantially impaired across all of those dimensions. And they ran 9 minutes through terrain that should have taken 23. My hypothesis, and I want to be clear that it is a hypothesis, not a finding, and that I am filing it here precisely because I believe it deserves formal scientific investigation, is that there is a category of human performance that our resource deprivation models do not capture, and that this category is activated rather than degraded under certain conditions of extreme necessity. I am not describing a supernatural phenomenon. I am describing something more mundane and, in some ways, more troubling. The possibility that the behavioral envelope we have been using for human forces in extremity is not the ceiling, that it is the floor. That the humans of the 43rd, in the 9th minute of their run through the northwestern terrain, were not performing despite their condition, but in some partial way because of it. Because 41 days of encirclement had stripped away every option except the one they were executing, and the simplicity of that, one objective, one direction, everything else irrelevant, produced something in their performance profile that our models have no variable for. I do not know how to model that. I am not sure it can be modeled with the tools I currently have. I have requested a meeting with the Behavioral Science Division. The meeting is scheduled for next month. I have asked them to read this document before we speak. Days 29 through 31. The third element of the 43rd broke through the cordon on day 28 and moved into the open terrain south of the Harran Basin. The 2 diversionary elements, after their engagements, withdrew back into the substrata and proceeded to conduct a fighting retreat toward the same gap over the following 3 days, by which point the Keth cordon had been reorganized and the gap had been closed, which meant that the 2 diversionary elements exfiltrated through the cordon in a different way than the third element had, through a different part of the terrain, using a different method. I am not going to walk through the details of each element's movement in the same depth I have applied to the earlier analysis, because the forensic reconstruction becomes increasingly uncertain as the 43rd dispersed. What I can tell you is that all 3 elements reached the outer settlement at Farron's approach within 48 hours of each other, approximately 33 to 35 days after the encirclement began. The Keth sector commands assessment on day 31, when the last element was confirmed to have exfiltrated. 43rd Consolidated Human Defense Force has successfully withdrawn from the Oreth corridor. Encirclement operation has not achieved its objective. That is the formal record. What the formal record does not capture, and what I want to spend the remaining portion of this assessment attempting to describe, is what I have come to believe those 41 days actually demonstrated. I have been in strategic assessment for 31 years. In that time, I have reviewed post-action records from engagements involving 11 different species across 23 distinct theaters of conflict. I have seen forces perform above expectation. I have seen forces perform below expectation. I have seen desperate operations succeed and careful operations fail, and every permutation between. I understand, at a professional level, that models are approximations, and that the gap between a model and reality is where the interesting work is done. I have never seen a gap like this one. The 43rd Human Defense Force, over 41 days of encirclement, performed at a level that my models, which have been validated across hundreds of prior engagements, did not predict and cannot fully explain even in retrospect. Not because the models were wrong about physics, or about supply math, or about the mechanistic relationship between ammunition and sustained fire. The models were correct on all of those dimensions. The 43rd ran low on everything the models said they would run low on, at approximately the time the models said they would. They were hungry when the models said they would be hungry, and wounded when the models said they would be wounded, and degraded in every physical dimension the models track. They just did not behave accordingly. And that is the gap, not in the supply curves, not in the casualty projections, not in the orbital mechanics, in the behavior, in the choice made repeatedly over 41 days to continue operating as though the problem were solvable when every metric I track said it was not. I have been trying to find the right framework for what I observed. I want to be careful here, because I am a logistics analyst and not a behavioral scientist, and I am aware that I am operating outside my primary expertise. But I have spent 4 weeks with this data, and I think I have something to say about it, even if I cannot say it with the precision I would prefer. Every model I use is built on a foundational assumption, that a force will, at some point, accept the conditions that obtain. Not surrender, necessarily. There are forces that choose destruction over surrender, and our models handle that. But acceptance. The recognition, at some level of the organism's decision-making, that the situation is what it is, and that behavior should be calibrated accordingly. What I observed in the 43rd was not acceptance. It was not that they failed to recognize their situation. The communications record is explicit. Colonel Voss and her command element knew, with considerable precision, what their supply state was, what their casualty rate was, what the strength of the force surrounding them was, and what the conventional military analysis of their situation would produce. They were not deluded about their circumstances. They simply declined to treat those circumstances as definitive. I am not sure I can explain the distinction better than that. They treated their situation as a problem rather than as a verdict. And they kept treating it that way for 41 days, through 2 resupply operations, through a corridor breakthrough on foot through impassable terrain, through every threshold that our models identify as the point at which a rational force accepts its situation. The cascade threshold is a well-supported concept. I helped develop the human-specific version of it 8 years ago when we were trying to adapt our general sustainment models to account for human physiology. We did a great deal of careful work. We reviewed the best data available. I stand behind the methodology. I am telling you that the 43rd Human Defense Force crossed the cascade threshold and did not notice, or noticed, and chose not to care. There is one more thing I want to include in this record, and then I will close with my formal recommendations. On day 36, after the 3rd element had broken through the cordon, and while the 2 diversionary elements were still in the process of exfiltrating, one of the Keth pursuit teams caught up with a small detachment from the 2nd diversionary element in a valley system, approximately 14 kilometers south of the substrata. The detachment consisted of 11 human soldiers. The pursuit team consisted of 42 Keth combatants in 2 armored vehicles, which had been tracking the detachment's thermal signatures for approximately 6 hours. The pursuit team's commander was a subcommander named Vareth On, and his after-action report is included in the records I reviewed. I want to quote one passage from it, because I think it captures something that the casualty figures and the supply curves and the movement timelines do not. Subcommander On wrote, "We had positional advantage and numerical advantage and were, at the point of engagement, fully resupplied and at operational readiness. The 11 humans had been on the move for 36 days. They had no armor. They had ammunition for perhaps another 20 minutes of sustained fire. 3 of them were visibly injured. We called for their surrender in the approved manner. They declined. What followed lasted for 2 hours and 40 minutes, after which 7 of the 11 humans had withdrawn into terrain we did not assess as accessible, and we were no longer able to maintain effective pursuit. We sustained casualties of 14. I am filing this report because I believe the engagement parameters need to be revisited. I do not believe our engagement doctrine adequately accounts for a force in this condition that declines to behave as though it is in this condition." I think Subcommander On said it more clearly than I have managed to in 40 pages of analysis. The 43rd declined to behave as though they were in their condition. That is the finding. That is what I believe the Oreth corridor engagement demonstrated, at a cost that I will not minimize and that I do not want to see repeated. We have models for many things. We have models for ammunition and nutrition and casualties and sleep deficit and command coherence, and a dozen other factors that shape what a surrounded force can do and how long it can sustain it. Those models are well built. I am not recommending that we discard them. I am recommending that we add a variable that we have not previously modeled, because we did not have the data to justify including it. I am recommending that we include, in our assessment framework for human forces specifically, some coefficient for the gap between the conditions a human force is objectively in, and the conditions a human force is willing to treat as definitive. I do not yet know what that coefficient should be. What I know is that it is not 0, and I know, from 41 days of drone footage and communications intercepts and medical records, and the after-action reports of Keth commanders who encountered the 43rd under the encirclement and came away with a different understanding of what they were dealing with than the one they had started with. I know that whatever number we eventually assign to it, it is higher than anything currently in our models. My formal recommendations are as follows. 1. The Oreth corridor engagement record should be classified and reviewed by the Directorate's Behavioral Science Division as a priority assessment, with particular attention to the gap between predicted and observed performance across all 6 major incident clusters in the 41-day period. 2. The human-specific cascade threshold model should be suspended pending revision. It should not be used in planning for operations against human forces until the revision is complete. 3. Subcommander On's after-action report, specifically the passage I have quoted above, should be circulated to all Keth sector commanders operating in theaters where human forces are present, without editorial modification. It says what needs to be said in fewer words than I have used to say it. 4. I recommend a formal review of the engagement doctrine for encirclement operations against human forces. The current doctrine is built on the assumption that sufficient encirclement pressure over sufficient time will produce behavioral outcomes consistent with a force that has accepted its situation. I believe the Oreth corridor engagement provides compelling evidence that this assumption does not reliably hold. I have one additional observation that I am recording here, because it does not fit neatly into any of the formal recommendation categories, but which I believe is the most important single thing I have to say. I have reviewed the communications from Colonel Voss's command element across all 41 days. I have reviewed her operational orders, her briefings to her company commanders, her requests to her logistics staff, her terse acknowledgments when resupply plans fell short, and her adjustments when they did. I have read everything she committed to a communication channel in 41 days. I have not found a single communication in which she indicated that she believed they were finished. I have found communications where she acknowledged that the situation was serious. I have found communications where she acknowledged the casualties, specifically, by name, in terms that are personal and evidently genuine. I have found communications where she disagreed with her own company commanders about the probability of success for specific operations, and where she incorporated their arguments into revised planning. I have not found the communication where she decided it was over. I do not know if that communication exists and was not captured, or if it exists and was not transmitted, kept internal, never voiced. I do not know if she came close, on any of those 41 days, to the decision I expected her to reach by day 12 at the latest. What I know is that she did not transmit it, and the force she commanded, through 41 days of encirclement, behaved consistently with a force whose commander had not decided it was over. That is, as far as I can determine, the entire explanation. The models did not fail because the inputs were wrong. The models failed because they were built on the assumption that there is a point at which any rational force concludes that the situation is what it is, and that point, for the 43rd Human Defense Force, may not have existed. I have thought about how to describe this in terms that would be useful to the behavioral science division, and the best I have arrived at is this. Every model I use for force behavior under encirclement contains, implicitly, a ceiling, a point at which the inputs to the model become so degraded that the outputs converge on a single value. Call it terminal. Call it the endpoint of rational operation. The model produces it not as a special case but as the natural end state of the function. Push the inputs low enough, and the outputs collapse to a single outcome. Surrender, or destruction, or some version of cessation that amounts to the same thing. What I observed in the 43rd is a force that may not have contained that ceiling. Not because they were impervious to the inputs, I have documented extensively that they were not, but because the function itself, for reasons I cannot identify in any biological or psychological literature I have been able to locate, did not converge in the way the model expects. The inputs degraded. The outputs did not collapse. They kept producing operational behavior, flawed, costly, resource-constrained operational behavior, but behavior, sustained action directed at a problem that had not been declared unsolvable, until the force was no longer encircled. I am filing this here because it belongs in the record. I am asking that it be taken seriously, not as a philosophical observation, but as a planning problem. The Keth Directorate spent 41 days and significant resources encircling a force it expected to neutralize in 12. The gap between those two numbers is not a tactical failure. It is a modeling failure, and modeling failures unaddressed repeat. The humans of the 43rd did not escape because we made errors. They escaped because they kept deciding, one day at a time, that they had not yet exhausted what was possible. Our models have no variable for that. They need one. Until we build it, every projection we produce for human forces under encirclement should be treated as a lower bound, the minimum they will do, rather than a prediction of what they will actually do when the options run out and the arithmetic says it's over. Assessment complete. Vane Oresi, Senior Analyst, Keth Directorate Strategic Assessment Division, Orath Sector Review.